Luckily for the Virginians, a new fad caught on in Europe by 1617. A popular pastime for European middle and upper classes began to revolve around smoking clubs, where New World products were consumed, most notably rum and molasses made out of sugar, coffee imported from various parts of the world, and the newest product, a leafy plant called tobacco, which could be dried and smoked. These were all addictive products that became all the rage throughout Europe. So this image shows some 18th century guys enjoying their enjoying their pipes. So you would go to these smoking clubs and you'd drink coffee and smoke a pipe tobacco, and that would give you kind of a double high. You get the little kick from the caffeine and then your kick from the unfiltered tobacco. And then you'd slow yourself down again by drinking rum. So, one of the Virginia colonists and a former Sea Dog veteran named John Rolfe got hold of some tobacco seed from raids on Spanish ships and colonies in Central America. He brought this seed back to Virginia in 1612, and by 1616, tobacco became a profitable export, and the Virginia Company had finally found what it needed to make profits. By 1618-19, Virginia colonists were growing tobacco everywhere they could, on their land holdings, in their yards, everywhere. The colony's rhythm of life began to revolve around the agricultural cycles of tobacco. The most profitable land was near the rivers, where colonists would grow tobacco plants, harvest and dry the leaves, pack the dried product into what they called hogsheads, a type of barrel, and then they would roll those barrels down the hills to the rivers, where ships would pick them up and take them to Europe. Tobacco in the 17th century required intense and constant labor input at all stages of production. So you want the nutrients to go to the leaves, not to flowers. So every day, if you're growing tobacco, you had to go out there and remove the flowers from the plant so the nutrients go to the leaves instead. And you also have to remove the bugs or remove the pests, and that has to be done by hand. So every day you've got to do that. Once you harvest the tobacco leaves, the drying process required daily work to make sure the leaves dried correctly. So because of this, labor became a serious and vexing issue for the Virginia Company. They had to figure out how to bring labor into the colony because in order to make money off tobacco, you needed a lot of labor input for the plant. So Virginia became a strange place because of tobacco. Remember that Virginia's purpose was to make profit. That was its purpose, little else. It was started by a company. So most settlers didn't see Virginia as a place that they would stay and make a new world. They saw it as a place where they would go temporarily, make lots of money, then go back to England. So a few people saw it as a place to acquire land for themselves when it was impossible to acquire land in Europe. But even then, making the quick buck was their primary focus. So there was very little push to make Virginia into a place that was like England in any way. And it remained a very unstable society as a result. The hyper focus on agricultural profits meant that building a stable society was a low priority. So there were three classes of Virginians: the free people who owned some land. These were the secondary nobles or middle classes from English society who had a little bit of money to invest and acquire land grants from the Virginia Company. Of that highest class, the people with real power were the planters who acquired land early and got in on the ground floor, so to speak, and they were able to consolidate and expand their land holdings. By the 1640s, this was a small minority of the Virginia population, about 5 to 10%, that controlled most of the wealth. The rest of the free farmers tried their best with the less arable and less well-positioned land, but they found it difficult to compete effectively against the large planters and struggled from year to year. A larger, lower class of English colonists in Virginia came from England's working classes. In England, it was not fun to be a working class person. If you were a day laborer, you generally lived one step out of debtor's prison and in an urban slum. To recruit labor, the Virginia Company directly enticed these people to be indentured servants. They encouraged young and strong members of the British working class to sign an indenture contract, which looked something like this. This bonded labor to a master in Virginia for 4 to 7 years. After the term of service was over, the master, whoever bought the contract, was responsible for providing what were called freedom dues to the servant. Typically, this included some cash, tools, maybe a mule or a horse, and more importantly, 50 acres of land. These types of contracts were common in England, but they never included land, so the Virginia versions looked very attractive. Thousands of people from the young English working class signed up, mostly men, but a few women as well. The contract would be signed by a recruit, then cut in half with a special device. The agents would then sell the top half of the contracts to prospective masters once the servants got to Virginia, and the servants would keep the bottom half. At the port, the masters would go to the group of newly arrived servants, and literally the two groups of people would put their contracts together to see whose half fit whose. It was kind of an awkward situation because you had to go up and down a line and kind of put your contracts together. These people were not slaves, but they were not completely free either. And they were constantly reminded of their status, which was not free. During the terms of service, masters had wide latitude of how to treat these people. So if servants were perceived to break any part of their contract, disobey their master in any way, they could be whipped, they could be tortured, they could be imprisoned, or worse, they might have their contract extended. What was worse was that for the first 50 years of settlement in Virginia, about 2 out of 3 servants died before they served out their contract. Masters would actually encourage that, giving their servants the hardest work late in their terms to try to avoid paying freedom dues. When servants did survive, the goods and lands they were given as freedom dues were the worst possible tracts of land. The land that was, far out away from a river and close to dangerous Indians, swampy, and so forth. At the bottom of the rung of the society were slaves. Slaves had no freedoms whatsoever in their persons, and they were bought and sold like real estate. Although that's not how slavery began. We'll get more into slavery in week 6. An interesting phenomenon that occurred in Virginia in the first 40 years or so was something called serial widowhood. So, women were at a premium in 17th century Virginia. The gender ratio of the population was 6 males for every female, 6 to 1 male. The average life expectancy for everyone was also very low. So most colonists in Virginia were lucky to make it past age 45. Often they died younger. These 2 women here are ladies Susanna and Beverly Randolph. They married into the Randolph family, one of the richest families in Virginia. Some women in Virginia, because of the gender imbalance, were able to become more wealthy in proportional terms than any non-royal women in the Western world. The way that would happen. Let's say a 19-year-old woman shows up in Virginia as a servant. She's bought by a master. That master frees her and marries her. The master is older and wealthier, maybe in his mid 30s. Life expectancy in Virginia is low. He dies at age 39. Now the woman in question is 23, and she has land inherited from her husband. English common law did protect widows. So if there's no male heir, then a widow would inherit her husband's property. So, although she's not supposed to stay, a widow wasn't supposed to stay unmarried for long. So, first husband dies at 39. Now the woman in question is 23 and has inherited land. She's now able to marry a richer landowner, someone who has more land. He dies at age 40, 5 years later. So now the widow is 27. She's got the accumulated land of her past two husbands, and she's richer than ever before, and can attract some of the wealthiest men in the colony who can't find a wife and would like to expand their land holdings. The woman in question may even outlive that husband, inheriting his property and becoming one of the richest people in the county. So by the 1640s, these legal loopholes were closed, as Virginia society became anxious about having such wealthy and powerful women present, something that was unique in the Western world. This serial widowhood phenomenon demonstrates how unstable and fluid Virginia society was. Such a male-heavy society was not a pleasant place. There were few churches. There were lots of taverns. There were few family-oriented activities and lots of gambling on things like cockfights and tests of strength and dueling. It was not a pleasant place, and most people in Virginia were in it for themselves and very competitive. For example, if you could find a way to get your neighbor drunk and then bet him on a cockfight for his tobacco land, you would do that. When he sobered up, you would then fight him in a duel if he contested the previous events. There was little community ethic in Virginia until after the 1650s, more than 50 years after initial settlement. 1660s. Land was spread out, population was spread out, there were few population centers, local government was organized into counties. The people who controlled the colony were also the richest people, and they used their positions of control to become more wealthy. Everyone in Virginia in those early years lived for the moment, knowing they would likely die before they hit 40. So Virginia was not a place you wanted to go and spend a lot of time.